In an age of fractured identities and rising borders, British thinker David Goodhart explains why Western societies are turning inward and why even successful Indian migrants now face suspicion. In this conversation, he unpacks the backlash to racial and cultural diversity in the West that is making many Indian legal immigrants feel uncomfortable and unwanted. This is a hot button issue, viewers, in this country. And we are glad to be speaking to someone who has at length dwelt upon these issues in numerous books. Thank you, Mr. Goodhart, for speaking to us. You've argued that Western politics today is divided between anywheres and somewheres. Could you first explain to our viewers what this actually means, these two words, anywheres and somewheres?
Yes, it's a term that describes some of the new divisions that have opened up in European and other Western societies in the last sort of 20, 30 years, based around the value divides arising from different levels of education mainly. We've had a huge expansion of higher education in most of our countries, including in India, in recent decades. And that has produced, perhaps particularly in Britain, but this applies to other countries too, a a divide in worldviews that's always been there to some extent, but has been exacerbated in recent years. So the people I call the people that see the world from anywhere, the anywheres, tend to be very highly educated. They've been to university, they may have further degrees, and particularly in this country, in the UK, going to university means usually leaving your family in your hometown, going to a residential university, 200 miles away. You move from the south of England to Manchester or Newcastle, and you join a completely different group of people, and that group of people tend to have a worldview nurtured by the modern university, which tend to be very liberal and tend to promote challenges to authority and tradition. And the anywhere worldview tends to be one that is comfortable with mobility, partly because the people themselves have been mobile in their own lives, is comfortable with mobility, openness, autonomy, and people tend to have an identity that comes from their own achievements, what I call um, an achieved identity. You've done well at school, you've gone to a good university, you have a successful professional career. Your sense of yourself sort of comes from inside, in a way. It comes from your own achievements. So it's easy for you to live in the edgy inner city and feel completely comfortable because your identity is sort of portable. It belongs to you. Whereas from the somewhere, but by the way, the anywheres are perhaps 25, 30% of the population, maybe a bit more these days. The anywhere somewhere division sounds very binary, but actually, if you read the book that I wrote called The Road to Somewhere, I talk about very many different kinds of anywheres, many different kinds of somewheres, and there's a kind of in-betweener group too. But the somewheres are probably about 40, 45, even half 50% of the population. They tend to be less well educated. They haven't been to university. They tend to value stability and their identities are more based around the places they come from, the groups that they belong to, things about themselves that are not really changeable. You're a white British male from the northeast of England, and those are important parts of your identity that are immutable. Um, and you can see from this distinction that somewhere people, if your identity is more based on place and group, then it's more likely to be discomforted by rapid change. So, say your neighborhood becomes gentrified, suddenly lots of better off people move in, or if there's suddenly a wave of immigration into your neighborhood,
Right.
you're more likely to feel uncomfortable about that because your identity is so connected to place and group. And the problem, both of these worldviews, the anywhere worldview tends to be It's one that we tend to associate with our countries, say at the beginning of the 21st century, the world of people like Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, a kind of a sort of metropolitan openness was characteristic of the anywhere worldview. Whereas now we've shifted to a worldview that is more inclined towards the sort of somewhere anxieties. One might call it provincial insecurity.
Hmm.
Um, as I say, both of the worldviews are perfectly decent. I'm not trying to demonize the anywhere worldview and regard the somewhere worldview as sort of sacrosanct or heroic in some way. Both of them are perfectly decent. The problem for our politics in Britain and other Western societies is the anywhere worldview has been too dominant.
Right.
Anywheres, anywheres have ruled in their own interests. They have been, they've wanted more and more higher education in the education policy. When it comes to immigration, they're very comfortable with immigration because it tends not to challenge their interests or threaten their identity.
Hmm.
They've been indifferent about the destruction of traditional industries because they tend to belong to the sort of professional managerial class. They work in consultancies or in finance. So they've been indifferent to the decline of industry. You can look at a whole range of different policies and see how they have really they have been in the interests of that highly educated anywhere class,
Right.
and the somewheres feel that their interests have not been recognized. And so you then get this sort of incoherent, disorganized sort of pushback against anywhere domination. We saw it in the UK with the vote for Brexit. We saw it in the US with the first and the second vote for Donald Trump. Um, and my appeal is that we need a kind of new form of politics, which we don't simply want to replace anywhere rule with somewhere rule. We want a politics and politicians who can cross the divide, who can speak to both groups and
The,
fight, because there is obviously a lot of common ground between the two groups too. Everyone wants the government to be efficient, everyone wants the health service to work well, and
True,
so
but
on.
sorry to butt in, but Mr. Goodhart, obviously politicians see it in different terms. They're looking constantly for constituencies, and there are many more binaries that they view politics through, and therefore you have one group being sort of pandered to more than the other, and there is very little middle ground that is obviously sought to be struck. Now, this is happening here in India too, between, one would say, cosmopolitan elites and
Mm.
rooted vernacular voters. And do you think India somewheres have managed to seize the political narrative perhaps more effectively than even their Western counterparts? And I'll give you a small anecdote. Our Prime Minister, for example, refers to some of these anywheres, this cosmopolitan elite, as the Lutyens' ecosystem, and by which he means those that are slightly more deracinated from their roots and are people who have adopted Western mores. And Lutyens was the architect who built
Yeah,
New
yeah,
Delhi.
yeah, I know. Yeah, yeah.
So there is that binary. Do you think this is what's happening here in our country, in India?
Yes, that's very interesting. I mean, I don't know a huge amount about Indian politics, but from what you describe it fits into the anywhere, somewhere divide. But it sounds as if your prime minister is simply sort of taking one side in the argument, and it may be that there is some justification for that when as it were somewhere interests have been suppressed for so long. You're bound to get something of a pushback, but surely I think we need to acknowledge that there is something important and useful for the common good in India from the Lutyens classes as well as the vernacular classes, as it were. We need to find areas of common interest. Now, it may be that the Lutyens classes have been too powerful for too long, and they need to be and they need to seem to have their wings clipped. If
Yeah, that
they're
really is the overriding impression, and I think that's all that is being sought to be done here. I think. I mean, I'm only taking what is an educated guess, because that's usually the rhetoric that follows when someone uses that binary. But I just wanted to move you a little back into your own comfort zone, the West.
Hmm.
The somewhere backlash is now taking on, forgive me for saying this, I mean, again, this is an observation, an anti immigrant sort of form. Are we seeing the same pattern when politicians in the UK or the US blame, for example, Indian migrants, students, tech workers, doctors for housing shortages or job competition, and so on and so forth?
Um, yes, I mean, I wouldn't want to exaggerate that element to it. I would say there's been a backlash against mass immigration rather than against individual immigrants. I think it's true. Probably the number of actual racist incidents has increased somewhat in recent months. But I think you have to look at the broader picture, and I think there has been a quite extraordinary, again, just talking about the UK here, quite an extraordinary increase in immigration flows, particularly after the pandemic. I think between 2021 and 2024, about 2.5 million people have arrived in the UK, in something like 4% of the entire population. Um, and if you look at the slightly longer term, since 1997, when we had the great, what one might call the great second wave of immigration to the UK after the initial period in the 1950s and the 1960s, when people from the Commonwealth, the former empire, came from India and Pakistan and the Caribbean and Africa in relatively small numbers, but establishing Britain as a multi-ethnic society in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Immigration then tailed off in the 80s and the 90s. We had very little net immigration. It then took off again with Tony Blair's government in 1997 and has never really stopped. And I mean, if you look at the demographic structure of Britain, it's really the pace of change is really quite extraordinary. Um, I think almost unprecedented. I mean, bigger even than the great American migration of the late 19th, early 20th century. So, I mean, so if you go back just to the turn of the century in the UK, so the end of the 1990s, around 2000, the the British majority, the white British, the sort of ancestral majority of the UK was about 89, 90% of the population. Now the white British population is about 70%. In England, probably even a bit less than 70%. I mean, this is an extraordinary rapid change. Um, I mean, have the British people become racist? I don't think so. I think the opinion polls still find that I think it's only something like 3% of British people say that you have to be white to be truly British. That there is a hardcore of people who have very bigoted and racist views, and perhaps they have become more confident in recent months, partly because of the way that the political language has changed. But political language has changed because reality has changed, because we have had this extraordinary, particularly, I mean, we had a big increase starting in 1997. We were the only big European country to open our labour market without any delay to people from Eastern and Central, the former communist countries, in 2004. The Brexit vote was a sort of revolt against that. It was a revolt against immigration, which was white Christian immigration, by the way. This was not prejudice against
Mm-hmm.
brown people or black people. Um, we then had that, you'll remember, that long argument about what kind of Brexit we were going to have, and then we had the
Yes.
2019 election. Boris Johnson wins a big majority, partly again on the promise that we would actually implement the control on immigration that people had voted for in the Brexit referendum. And then instead of that control, we have the biggest wave of immigration in British history starting in 2021. And on top of that, we have all of the people coming in illegally on boats from France.
Yeah, and
Obviously,
that's the point. Look, I mean,
yeah,
we've been getting all these visuals of how should one put it, local nativists. For example, the Reform Party and many of their sort of leaders hitting the streets in, now these numbers are debatable, in million man marches or what have you, and nuance typically is lost. So you have a blurring of lines between illegal and legal migrants. And I just want to ask you this because Indians do form the largest group of skilled migrants, especially in mainstream English speaking Western democracies. I
Yeah.
have to ask you, why do successful law abiding Indian professionals still get painted with the same brush as perhaps illegal entrants? That nuance is increasingly being lost in the conversation.
I'm not sure that's true. I mean, don't forget, um, very recently we had a man of Hindu Indian ancestry who was the prime minister of the country. I mean, do you think it's possible to imagine something like that in India? Somebody whose
No, we've
parents
had
came.
minority, we've had, Dr. Manmohan Singh, but again, I just want to bring that back to, that's an interesting point, but was he
Yeah,
chosen,
Indians are the most.
was he chosen popularly? The fact is that when his face was on the ballot, he didn't do so well. Yes,
No,
he won
that
a
was nothing to
MPship,
do. Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
he was actually selected by a party, the Conservatives, that were in disarray. Would you not agree?
Yeah, I mean, he was the most competent man left standing. But no, there was never a discussion in the UK about his color or his background. I mean, the people were much more agitated by how rich he was than by the color of his skin. I mean, that was the issue with Rishi, and he had this terrible inheritance. There was no way he was ever going to win the election. But I think he remains, he retained his dignity in this very heavy defeat. He's become a columnist now for one of the big Sunday newspapers. He's still a look. I mean, Indians are the most successful large minority in the UK, and absolutely nothing is going to change that. Um, yes, the political conversation has become harder on immigration, but it's become harder for the very obvious reason that we have had historically unprecedented levels of immigration at a time when politicians of all parties have been promising to to bring numbers down and to control illegal entry. And neither of those things have happened. Um, and so, the language inevitably becomes a bit harder, and that gives, unfortunately, that does give
Has
confidence to
this
the.
extended to policy? We're seeing tightening of visa rules for job students staying on in Britain who've invested perhaps a fair, tidy sum in educating themselves and then being denied the opportunity to forward their prospects in the British market. We're seeing some of those policies now creeping in at a governmental level, which means that once again the wall is being raised. You could call them hurdles. Is this an outcome of this backlash really to uh, the everywheres or the
Mm,
anywheres?
mm. It is. I mean, the question is it a legitimate backlash? I
Hmm.
mean, obviously, we're not saying that, racist remarks in the street are obviously completely illegitimate, and it is regrettable. There probably has been an increase in that, but but societies are not just random collections of individuals. There has to be a very large proportion of the British public think that society is changing too fast. And one of the ways it's changing too fast is through dramatically high levels of immigration. Suddenly your neighborhood is changing. It's not, and you don't see familiar faces. It's not, those faces don't have to be white. The people don't have to be Christians, but just people that you're used to. And suddenly you're surrounded by people that you're not used to. I mean, this is and it's a normal human reaction to find that discomforting. And politicians have not responded to it. So you then get this kind of more incoherent. We have suddenly people are putting up English and British flags all over the country. and they're saying they're going to vote for a more radical populist party, Nigel Farage's populist party. But this is in response to the failure of conventional politics, a failure that was partly, I think, driven by a kind of anywhere um, uh, belief that strict control of borders was a bit old-fashioned, if not nativist. But it's not. I mean, every country has to control its borders, and when immigration rises too far, too fast, then people are going to react against it. But as I say, I mean, the Indian minority in Britain, I think, is very, very well established, very successful on the whole. That is not going to change. But yes, it is going to be harder to come here, at least for a period.
Hmm.
I mean, what we need is a sort of period to digest the very, very large wave of immigration that we've had in the last, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, but in the last 15 years. As I say, we've gone from 90% white British to less than 70% white British
Hmm.
in England. Um, and we need time, just like America had an immigration pause. If you know your American history, you'll know that after the huge immigration waves of the late 19th, early 20th century, there
Yes.
was an immigration stop effectively between the early 1920s and the mid 1960s,
Hmm.
uh, and then immigration took off again, and a lot of Asians, South Asians, ended up in America in the more recent wave. But there was that period where America had time, as it were, to digest the big immigration waves of earlier. And not coincidentally, that was the great period of the New Deal. That was the most sort of social democratic period in American history, if you
Would
like.
you would you say that this points to a contradiction in the moralism of liberal democracies, and there's now a degree of perhaps selectivity?
Sorry, what do you mean about selectivity?
Well, one would have expected liberal democracies, because let me just be very honest with you. When in India
Hmm.
there is a conversation that is centered around perhaps keeping the borders shut to illegal immigrants, even refugees, and or there are conversations around identifying them, so to speak, and externing them. There are sermons that are given by Western commentators to the Indian establishment saying that, look, you are going, you're heading in the opposite direction of what a liberal democracy should be. Yet we see the same sort of push or backlash in these Western liberal democracies, which sort of suggests that there is selective moralism at play.
Oh, well, I mean, everybody is selectively moralistic. um, so that doesn't surprise me. But yes, I would share your irritation if Western leaders are telling India to be more open while they themselves are becoming more closed. Although the kinds of politicians who are likely to be making those moralistic speeches are probably the same politicians that are saying, "Oh, don't worry about a few people coming over the English Channel in boats. It's a moral panic. I mean,
Hmm.
you read the features in the Financial Times or the Guardian or the liberal media, and they'll be saying they'll be appalled at the degree of support for reform, or they're saying, well, your country may be changing dramatically before your eyes, but you've just got to suck it up,
Yeah, because
because
essentially some of those people might say that they are celebrating diversity,
exactly, yeah,
and
yeah,
therefore sort of look askance at those who say that they're feeling overrun, so to
yeah,
speak.
exactly. But of course, they're enjoying diversity from parts of London or parts of the country that probably haven't really been affected very much by diversity. It tends to be the ordinary people whose lives are most impacted by rapid change. They're the ones who have the real competition in because we don't plan ahead. When no one was expecting this huge. We just had 2.5 million people arrived without any planning for it. So as with the huge surge of people from Eastern Europe after 2004, and so it means there is congestion on the roads. It means that there's more people are using the hospital that you use. It's harder to get an appointment with your local doctor,
Okay.
and so on and so forth. And and often the people that are taking the moral high ground are not people who's who's who have to they have jobs that tend not to be threatened by
So what you're
competition.
saying is that the backlash is not rooted in xenophobia, but it is rooted in frustrations that there's not enough going around because, well, there are many more people now to share in the spoils of welfare and so on and so
Yeah.
forth. Okay, so hang on. So let me just center this conversation once again back to the Indian experience. Do you believe that Indian and perhaps even Asian migrants have become collateral in then a Western identity crisis, specifically a liberal Western identity crisis?
Um, well, I mean, it, it, Indians are our largest, as I said earlier, our largest minority, probably one of the largest groups of people who are still coming into the country on work visas, quite a high proportion on student visas, and most of them are going home afterwards. I mean, they're coming here for a reason, to benefit themselves, um, and they will go back, hopefully with a decent education, or with having earned probably more money than they might have done in India, and with useful job experience. I mean, these flows will continue. I think what we need for a period anyway is a stop on settlement rights. That we need a period, as I said, perhaps a little bit like America had, not stopping immigration completely, but disconnecting immigration from long-term settlement. Because when the demographic population, when the demographic structure of your society changes as fast as it has, you're bound to get a reaction. So we need to think about retaining the benefits of temporary immigration, both for the people that are coming from India and elsewhere, and for Britain, that still may need people in certain jobs, because we haven't been historically training enough people. I mean, one of the reasons we're so dependent on Indian IT workers, for example, is the fact that our own companies have not trained people enough. The employers are are partly responsible for these high inflows. They're the ones that have been lobbying for it and benefiting from it. Whereas the ordinary voter feels they're only getting the negatives from it. Yes, I mean, I don't think the picture is quite as bad as you paint it. I mean,
Okay.
I concede that it has, that the atmosphere has become worse for certain kinds of immigrant. I mean, that there are obviously many different kinds of Indian immigrant here. I mean, there are people that have been here for generations, that are British people, speak with British accents and so on. And then there are, you noticed this during the test series
So,
last
so,
summer.
so let me ask you this. What would you tell young Indians or Indians of South Asian, of long-standing roots in Britain, and perhaps even the US, who feel perhaps simultaneously accepted, successful, yet subtly unwelcome? What would you tell those Indians or Asians or what have you?
I'd say you shouldn't feel subtly unwelcome, because you're not subtly
So
unwelcome.
even if tomorrow Reform Party and some of the politicians that you mentioned came into power, or the British people decided to vote for them overwhelmingly, they should necessarily not feel anxious?
No, I don't think they should feel anxious. I don't think Reform is a racist party. Um, well, the second most important figure in the party, Zia Yusuf, is of Muslim Pakistani heritage. Um, no, Nigel Farage when he was a young man, he was an admirer of Enoch Powell, but he told me I did an interview with him
Hmm.
in 2018 on the 50th anniversary of Enoch Powell's famous Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. And he said to me that he'd been completely wrong, that Powell had been, he now realized that Edward Heath, who was then the leader of the Conservative Party, sacked Enoch Powell for the speech. He had been a front bench spokesman, and he was sacked. And Farage said that Heath, in retrospect, he agrees that Heath was right, that the extreme nature of the language he used had actually put back a sensible debate about immigration by 20 or 30 years, and that
Okay, well,
he
one's
did.
glad to hear that, but
Yeah.
let me point you in the direction of the United States for about 30 seconds. Trump packed his cabinet with a large number of Asian, specifically Indian Americans. Today, the MAGA base is turning on those individuals, calling them, quote, useful idiots, unquote. That could be said about Mr. Yusuf that you sort of referred to, perhaps a little down the line in UK. That could always happen.
Well, it could, but I'm telling you, it's not going to.
Hmm.
There will always be a few people, but I mean, I am confident enough to say here and now that that view is not ever going to become a dominant one in the UK. And we remain, as I said, 3% of people in opinion polls say you have to be white to be British. We are we've been used now. We've had 2 or 3 generations of being a multi-ethnic society. It's part of the way of life of the country, and Indians have played an enormously important part in that, and have become very successful and on the whole very well integrated. There are issues with some of the more recent Indian immigration. I mean, there were conflicts in Leicester that you may be aware of a couple of years ago that captured a lot of attention between Indians and Muslims. Leicester has had high levels of South Asian immigration now for 50 or 60 years. It's a city in the Midlands in England, which has
Yes.
a British population of only about 30% now, or 30 or 40%, and it had been a relatively successful multicultural city in many ways, and it was but when this conflict came, people put it down to the more recent Indian immigrants who, as it were, brought with them kind of Indian political prejudices. Um, and you had a conflict between the more recent arrivals from India
Well,
and the more recent arrivals.
the people who would make those unfounded assumptions are usually those that are already divided politically. So there is, of course, a larger conversation, and I feel that perhaps the Asians who came in to Leicester, as you say, recently, are being unfairly scapegoated. But that's a completely different kettle
No,
of fish.
no. I mean, no. I'm not being unfair. I mean, this is a well-established explanation for it. That there's quite a high consensus, including among Indians, that including among more established Indians, that this was the problem. People were bringing conflicts from the subcontinent to Leicester in a way that wasn't
Well, that
true
wasn't
in.
only down to, let's say, the Hindus, as you sort of seem to suggest. Look, I mean, I really don't want to go down that route because this will very quickly sort of transcend into name calling ethnicities and religions and creed and so on and so forth. So I don't think one could just say that, look, in Leicester it was the Hindus that were the problem or created the problem. But I understand what you're saying. The fact of the matter is that uh, and this is a question that I'll finally ask you and pose to you. Uh, has Western liberalism reached a dead end, a moral dead end, unable to decide whether it wants diversity or homogeneity? Would you categorize it as a crisis as elemental as that?
Absolutely not. We are multi-ethnic, multicultural societies. Um, Most people are happy with that, um, until the numbers and the pressure on the social infrastructure and so on become too great, and then people want to slow down. They don't necessarily want to stop. They want to slow down. And you got exactly the same reaction against too many white Christian people coming from Eastern Europe after 2004, which led to the Brexit vote. So this is not about race. It is about over rapid change. I mean, liberal democracy, I mean, to put it succinctly, liberal democracy has, in a sense, become a bit too liberal and not quite democratic enough. Um, I mean, as actually a brilliant columnist of himself of South Asian origin, Janan Ganesh, who writes a column in the Financial Times, put it, that actually that is in its simplest the explanation for populism. Liberal democracy became too liberal, too anywhere biased, too Lutyens class biased, and we're now experiencing a pushback. And one of the uh, small unintended consequences of that is that um, it has emboldened the very, very small number of of racists in our society, so that even a very successful, well-established third, fourth generation Indian person in Britain, in Harrow, in northwest London, is probably more likely to bump into somebody who will say something with a kind of racial tinge to them in the last year or two,
Right.
and that is an unfortunate side effect. But you only need, and of course a small number of prejudiced people now have a bigger voice in our societies thanks to social media and the internet. You have to remember that too. So people can easily get a feeling that things are sort of fundamentally changing when they're
True.
not really.
True.
The megaphone of social media has unfortunately given extra, or has given the appearance of much greater support for these minority views. They remain very, very minority views. I
Well,
really want to reassure you of that.
well, it's nice to end on an optimistic note amongst all this churn and change. Thank you very much, Mr. Goodhart, for speaking to me. This has been a good and enlightening conversation. Thank you.
Thank you too.